Football is a violent sport. And the thing is, the big hits have always been a part of the sport, going way back. The crazy thing is when you realize that most players used to play both ways on every single play. Now remember, this isn't necessarily like the ancient history of football, at least not in college. In fact, as recently as right after World War II, it was common for players to play on both offense and defense. That's simply unthinkable today. But have you ever thought of why? The history of football's substitution rule is actually pretty deep, and it's also pretty fascinating. In the beginning, there were no substitutions at all. Football was a lot like rugby in those days. In fact, it was rugby. In 1882, the year that Walter Camp first started the down system, the rules were liberalized to allow substitutions for injured and disqualified players. The truth, though, is that most players in those days played both sides of the ball for the entire game and without helmets or pads either. Those were the days of the famous flying wedge, a formation inspired by military tactics that was known for causing serious injuries. Formations like the V were quickly banned, but the sport was still extremely violent. And as the numbers of players injured and even killed while playing the game started to grow, there were cries for change, or even for abolishing the sport altogether. Well, in other words, all that talk that we had a few years back about concussions and serious injuries in football are really nothing new. In fact, that kind of discussion has been around the sport for a very long time now, and believe it or not, things actually used to be worse. Without a doubt, the most notoriously violent football game in its history was the 1894 Harvard-Yale game. While the game might have been in its infancy, this rivalry was absolutely huge and had already attracted a huge amount of newspaper attention. The game itself wasn't really that close, but the brutality was notorious. This brief excerpt from the pages-long Boston Globe article will give you an idea. Charlie Brewer had to be taken out with an injured ankle. Notably, he tried to prove he could still play by crawling around on his hands and knees. A Harvard player named Wrightington had his collarbone broken. Allegedly, this happened at the hands of the Yale captain. The referee hadn't seen it, and the linesmen weren't supposed to report on misconduct leading to injury like that. Another Harvard man named Hollowell broke his nose and had to leave. There's no doubt that the officials let this game get out of hand. But you know, change didn't come to the sport quickly, and of course, it's not really clear that substitutions would have prevented the violence. After all, the real cause of the violence and the problems in that game was probably the rivalry between Harvard and Yale and how heated it had become. Anyway, though, it took a few more years before a sensible substitution rule finally came about. Before the 1897 season, the substitution rule was liberalized to allow a player to be substituted for another player at any time based on the captain's discretion. However, a player who had been replaced could not come back into the game. And as shocking as this might seem today, coaching during the game was strictly prohibited. It would take decades for teams to start having substitutes sneak in the next play call. The idea back then was that quarterbacks should call all of their plays with no assistance from the coaches at all. That's actually a topic that needs a video on its own. This is a rule that was in effect until 1967 in college football, which is crazy. Don't be fooled though, substitutions were still rare. In fact, it's not all that hard to find games from 1905, for example, in which no substitutes were used at all. Of course, substitutions in sports in general in those days were pretty rare. We forget about that. We're really used to seeing players coming off and going on all the time. Back then, though, things were different. Actually, almost every sport was an Iron Man sport. Baseball, for example, did not allow for more than one substitution in a game until 1891. According to this article, substitutions in hockey back in 1901 were only allowed when there was some kind of injury. And over in England, substitutes weren't a thing in soccer until 1965, which is something I was shocked to learn the other day. But of course, none of those sports are quite as violent as American football, and in the end, it was the violence that caused things to change. The common 9-man defensive line and the fact that all plays were running plays in those days absolutely contributed to the injury toll. In 1906, the forward pass was made legal, largely in hopes of opening up the game and preventing injuries from mounting. The rule that you needed 10 yards for a first down also started in 1906. Earlier it had been only 5 yards, leading to all sorts of brutal play. But that didn't stop the deaths. 1909 was actually the most brutal year in football history. In fact, the outcry about the game was stronger in 1909 than it had ever been before. Alonzo Stagg proposed liberalizing the forward pass even more to make the play more common. The committee that met early in 1910 decided to make a number of changes to fight against the mass running plays that were still common in those days. They required that 7 men be on the offensive line and allowed the quarterback to basically run at will. Earlier, he had to move at least 5 yards to the left or right before he could go forwards. But this rule right here was the most radical of them all. Any player who had been removed from the game could come back at the beginning of any subsequent quarter. That rule was important because it meant that players could take a break without having to completely exit the game. It's also the rule that created the first concept of specialization in the sport, or of having players who would go into the game at certain times for certain reasons. The sport has never looked back since. Now, you've absolutely heard of the Four Horsemen of Notre Dame, right? The famous backfield of 1924. Well, the truth, though, is that Notre Dame's strength that season lied as much in its substitutes as in its starters. Knute Rockne was known for putting in his second-string team to start the game and then bringing the first-string team in to relieve them when things were going wrong. It was a brilliant psychological move that reflected his coaching genius. But, substitutions were still pretty limited. In fact, they would remain limited until World War II when things suddenly changed. In 1941, a few months before America went to war, the topic of unlimited substitutions was on everybody's minds. The rule was controversial, and interestingly enough, most coaches didn't really make much use of it at first. By 1949, however, there was a major debate about two-platoon football, something that more conservative fans and coaches thought would destroy the game. Now, the NFL turned to unlimited substitutions in 1950 and really never looked back. In the college game, however, the situation was different. The debate over platoons coincided with a number of colleges dropping the game completely, including teams that were once famous, such as Fordham. This is also around when the Ivy League schools started to seriously de-emphasize the game. These were, of course, the same schools that had originally been the heart of the sport. And so, in 1953, the powers in charge decided to eliminate the unlimited substitution rule. Well, it's clear that they made this decision to try to protect the smaller schools. The idea was that the smaller schools simply could not compete with schools that had more players and that could rotate fresh players in and out all the time. And actually, that's still a problem to this day. However, if you take a step back and you look at the bigger issue, you'll realize that unlimited substitution really is necessary in a sport with so much physical contact. I mean, it's ridiculous to expect players to play a game this physical for hours at a time without a break. And so the colleges slowly moved back to unlimited substitutions, literally tweaking the rules every single year until they made it back. So you'll never see pictures of players lining up to sign in with a referee like this one ever again. By 1964, unlimited substitution and the two-platoon game were back to stay for good. And of course, it's for the best. It's really sad that the smaller schools and that the Ivy League schools have basically dropped the sport. However, for the sake of player safety, it's only natural that there should be unlimited substitutions, because the alternative to that is just totally insane.